The kitchen light was still on at midnight. Outside, rain tapped slow against the window. Inside, the only sounds were a clock on the wall and the soft scratch of a pencil moving across paper. She wasn't doing homework. She wasn't writing a letter. She was doing something nobody would understand for another 60 years. Her name was Dorothy, 1959, a small town in Ohio, one husband, 2 children, a house that wasn't theirs yet, and a monthly income that by any modern standard should have been impossible to live on. But while the neighbors were borrowing money from the bank, while the families down the street were signing their names to things they didn't yet understand, Dorothy was doing something different. She never owned a credit card. She never walked into a loan office. And yet, by 1963, her family owned their home outright. How? That question sat unanswered for decades, hidden inside an old ledger no one thought to open. Tonight, we open that ledger. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Her real story didn't start with success. It started with a decision no one noticed. The weight of what nobody sees. It was a Tuesday in early October when Dorothy sat down at that kitchen table and felt, for the first time in months, genuinely afraid. Not the kind of afraid that announces itself, not tears or raised voices, the kind that settles quietly into the chest, a cold, careful pressure, the kind a woman learns to carry without showing, the kind that has no name but sits behind the eyes all day long. The heating bill had gone up again. The children needed winter shoes. The refrigerator had been making a noise for 3 weeks that nobody wanted to talk about. And there was a number on that paper, a small number, a number that didn't leave much room, that she'd been staring at for 20 minutes without writing a single thing down. Her husband worked. He worked hard, 6 days a week, early mornings, tired evenings. But work in 1959 meant a fixed wage, a fixed world, and almost no margin for the unexpected. And October, somehow, was always full of the unexpected. Here is what Dorothy did not do. She did not call her mother to borrow money. She did not walk into a bank and sign something she would spend years regretting. She did not cry at the table, at least not then. She picked up the pencil, she opened the ledger, and she began doing something she had been taught, not by a school, not by a book, not by anyone with a title or a certificate on their wall, but quietly watching her own mother survive a decade far harder than this one. There is a particular kind of strength that never gets written about. It doesn't shout, it doesn't perform, it just sits down at the table every single month and does the work. How did she even begin? The first mental shift. Dorothy didn't change everything overnight. That wasn't her way. She started with one small habit that most people would have considered almost too simple to matter. Before she spent a single dollar, she waited, not long, just long enough to ask herself one quiet question. Do we need this, or does it just feel like we need this right now? It sounds easy. It wasn't. Because the feeling of needing something and the reality of needing something are two very different things. And in 1959, the stores were getting better at blurring that line every single season. She started writing down every purchase before she made it. Not after, before. Just the act of writing it down changed something in her mind. It made the spending feel real before the money was gone. And once something felt real, she could look at it clearly, without emotion clouding the decision. Her neighbor Ruth thought she was being too careful, too rigid. Ruth had a department store card and wore it like a quiet kind of confidence.
Dorothy never said a word about it. She just watched, and she noticed that Ruth's confidence had a payment due date attached to it every single month. There were warm moments, too. Saturday mornings when the children helped her sort the grocery list. Her youngest would read the numbers back to her in a serious little voice, and Dorothy would smile without explaining why it mattered. It mattered because she was teaching without teaching, passing something forward without making it feel like a lesson. Today, most people spend emotionally first and calculate the damage later. Dorothy did it the other way around. She calculated first, then she spent, calmly, deliberately, without guilt or regret. But the grocery store would test her resolve.
Grocery survival strategy. The grocery store in 1959 was a different kind of battlefield. No loyalty apps, no digital coupons, just prices on paper tags, a basket on your arm, and the quiet pressure of children walking beside you who occasionally wanted things. Dorothy entered with a list. Not a rough idea of a list, a real list, written the night before, organized by aisle, built entirely around ingredients rather than finished products. She wasn't shopping for meals, she was shopping for components, things that could become 3 different dinners depending on what the week demanded. She compared prices the way a careful person reads a contract, slowly, without embarrassment. She would stand in an aisle longer than felt socially comfortable, doing the arithmetic in her head, choosing the option that made the numbers work, not the option in the prettier packaging. Then, one afternoon, her son pointed at a box of chocolate cookies on the middle shelf. He didn't beg, he just looked at her with those patient eyes, and Dorothy felt the pull, that warm, familiar pull that every parent knows. She picked up the box, looked at the price, set it back down. Then she did something she called the 7-day rule. She wrote it on the back of the grocery list. If he still wanted it in 7 days, she would reconsider. Most of the time, 7 days passed, and neither of them mentioned it again. The wanting had simply dissolved on its own, the way most wanting does when given enough time and silence. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. She was teaching her son the difference between a feeling and a need, the most valuable lesson she knew, without either of them realizing a lesson was happening at all. But groceries weren't the biggest threat. The ledger secrets. The ledger itself was nothing special to look at. Dark green cover, slightly warped at the spine, bought from a stationery shop sometime around 1955. But what was inside it was something else entirely. Most household ledgers of that era had 2 columns, money coming in, money going out. Simple enough, understandable enough. Dorothy's ledger had 3. The 3rd column had no printed label. She had written one herself, in small, careful letters at the top of the page. It said simply, held. Held wasn't savings exactly. It wasn't a rainy day fund in the way people talk about rainy day funds. It was something more deliberate than that. Money in the held column had already been mentally assigned to a specific future need, a specific month, a specific quiet emergency she could feel coming even if she couldn't name it yet. Behind the last page of the ledger, folded flat and easy to miss, was a hand-drawn barter table. Neighbors who had exchanged things with the family. A jar of preserved peaches traded for an afternoon of sewing. 3 dozen eggs exchanged for help repairing the back fence. Nothing written as debt, everything written as relationship. Further back, a household inventory, updated every month, what they had, what was running low, what would need replacing within the next 90 days. She treated the house itself like a small business, quietly auditing it,
noting where, planning ahead before the crisis arrived uninvited. To anyone who found that ledger by accident, it would have looked like the careful notes of an unusually organized woman. But it was more than organization. It was a complete financial system, designed, tested, and refined by someone who had learned that the families who survived difficult years weren't always the ones who earned the most. The real test came mid-month. Mid-month financial crisis. It happened on a Wednesday. The washing machine made one terrible sound, a deep, grinding protest, and then went completely silent. Dorothy stood in the laundry room for a moment and said nothing. Then she dried her hands on her apron, walked back to the kitchen, and opened the ledger to a page near the middle. There it was, an envelope labeled in pencil, "Appliance." Inside it, folded carefully, were $11. Not a fortune, but enough. She had been putting small amounts into that envelope for 7 months. Not because she knew the washing machine would fail, she didn't, but she knew that machines fail eventually, that houses cost money in ways that never appear on any schedule, and that being surprised by the predictable is one of the most expensive habits a family can have. This was the envelope system. Not one envelope, many. Each one labeled for a category of life that cost money irregularly. Medical, school, seasonal, appliance, repair. Each fed slowly, month by month, with whatever the budget allowed. Small amounts that individually felt almost meaningless, but collectively formed a cushion that made Wednesday's silence something manageable rather than something catastrophic. On the outside, nothing changed. Dinner was made. The children did their schoolwork. Her husband came home, and she mentioned the washing machine the way someone mentions mild weather, calmly, matter-of-factly, without alarm. Inside, she had been afraid for about 45 minutes. Then she had looked at the envelope, done the arithmetic, and the fear had simply released, the way fear does when a plan is already in place and waiting. Most people feel the crisis first. Dorothy had already solved it months ago. She made one bold move: community resourcefulness. The bold move wasn't dramatic. It never was with Dorothy. She walked 2 houses down to her neighbor Vivian's back door, knocked twice, and asked if she could use the wringer washer in Vivian's basement for the next 2 weeks while the repair was sorted. In return, she offered 3 afternoons of help putting up Vivian's winter preserves, a job Vivian had been dreading for weeks and quietly putting off. No money changed hands, no debt was created. Both women walked away with exactly what they needed. This kind of exchange was more common in 1959 than people remember, not because communities were more generous by nature, people are people in every era, but because the infrastructure of borrowing money wasn't yet fully built into daily life. Credit cards existed but weren't universal. Bank loans required paperwork and patience, and a certain kind of humility most families preferred to avoid. So neighborhoods developed their own quiet economies. Dorothy tracked every exchange in the back of the ledger, not to enforce repayment, but to maintain balance. She had a deep instinct that relationships sustained by fairness lasted longer than relationships sustained by obligation, and she had seen enough of both kinds to know the difference. The women on her street shared more than most people realized: patterns for children's clothing, surplus garden vegetables, knowledge about which butcher gave fair weight and which one needed watching. It was an informal intelligence network, practical, generous, and completely invisible to anyone looking from the outside. Dorothy contributed quietly and received gracefully. That second part was harder than it sounds. Receiving help, real help, needed help,
requires a particular kind of honesty about where you actually stand, and pride, she had learned, was the most expensive thing a family could carry. But pride nearly ruined everything. Emotional vulnerability. There was a month, February, the hardest month, when the envelope system came up short. Not dramatically short, just short enough that Dorothy needed to ask Vivian for a small loan to cover the children's school supplies and a doctor's visit that couldn't be delayed any longer. $12. 2 weeks. She would pay it back from the following month's held column. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time before she walked over there. In her ledger, in her own handwriting, she never used the word debt, not once. Where other household accounts of the era wrote IOUs or borrowed amounts, Dorothy used a single word that she had inherited from her mother's ledger before her. She wrote shame. Not to punish herself, not out of excessive guilt, but because she had been taught that money borrowed carries emotional weight, and that pretending otherwise is how families slip into borrowing more than they can carry, more comfortably than they should. The word was a reminder, a small, honest one. When she finally knocked on Vivian's door, her voice was steady. She explained the situation plainly, without embellishment, without excessive apology. Vivian handed her the $12 without hesitation and without commentary. Neither woman made it larger than it was. But walking home, Dorothy felt the full weight of it, the particular sting of needing something you hadn't planned for, of a system that almost held but didn't quite. She didn't run from that feeling. She let it sit. She wanted to remember it clearly enough that she would tighten the February envelope next year by at least $3. Financial honesty, she understood, requires a specific kind of courage. Now only 7 days remained. Final week tension. The last 7 days of the month were always the truest test. By this point, the grocery envelope was nearly flat. The household envelope had coins left, actual coins, counted out and stacked on the ledger like small copper arguments for discipline. The held column had been touched once, for the washing machine. She would not touch it again. Dorothy moved through those final days with a particular kind of quiet precision. Meals became simpler, not poorer, but leaner. Bean soup stretched across 2 dinners. Bread baked at home, because the arithmetic of a loaf of flour versus a loaf from the store was not a complicated one once you had done it enough times. She rechecked the pantry inventory she kept in the back of the ledger, noted what had been used, noted what remained, made small, careful adjustments, not panicked ones, not dramatic ones, the way a navigator makes corrections rather than reversals. Every dollar in those final days felt heavier than it had at the beginning of the month, not because she was desperate, but because she was paying close attention. Attention makes things feel real, and real things carry weight. Her husband noticed the meals getting simpler and said nothing. This was their quiet agreement, built not from conversation, but from years of watching each other move through difficult weeks with dignity intact. He took a little less, she stretched a little more. Nobody announced it. The children noticed nothing. That was the point. That had always been the point. By the 6th day, she could see the number. She could feel whether it would hold. She ran the final figures twice in the margin of the ledger, pencil pressed lightly, as if writing the numbers too hard might disturb something. Would it finally be enough? Month-end reveal. On the last evening of the month, Dorothy closed the ledger and sat quietly at the table for a few minutes. The number had held. Not perfectly, not with the kind of surplus that allows you to exhale completely and forget about it until next month, but the envelopes were accounted for.
The held column had been touched once and replenished. Vivian's $12 was set aside, ready to be returned in the morning. No new debt had been created. No new line had been signed. She made a small mark in the margin, a single horizontal line, the way her mother had taught her. It meant the month was closed, balanced, done. There was no celebration. She made tea, checked on the children, and turned off the kitchen light. The victory, if you could call it that, was completely invisible to everyone except her. And that, she understood, was exactly how it was supposed to feel. Because the real power was never the money was just the evidence. The real power was the discipline, the daily, unglamorous, deeply private practice of knowing exactly where you stood at every moment of the month and making deliberate choices from that knowledge rather than emotional ones. Her mother had taught her this, and her mother's mother before that, a chain of quiet women passing a ledger forward, not as a document of wealth, but as a document of intention. Here is what we have. Here is what we owe. Here is what we are building toward, slowly, without anyone needing to know. The home they would own by 1963 was not bought with a windfall. It was built one closed month at a time, one careful mark in the margin at a time, one invisible victory at a time.
2026 Emotional Connection. Dorothy's ledger is gone now, somewhere in a house that changed hands, in a drawer that was emptied without much thought, in a moment that nobody marked as significant. But the system she kept inside it, that is not gone. The problem today is not that people earn too little. Many people in 2026 earn in a month than Dorothy saw in a year. The problem is that the distance between earning and spending has collapsed to almost nothing. A thought becomes a purchase in under 30 seconds. A subscription begins quietly in January and is still quietly running in November. Comfort has been made so frictionless, so instant, so normalized that the pause Dorothy built into every single decision has been engineered almost entirely out of modern life. The 7-day wait is gone. The envelope is gone. The held column is gone. The ledger itself is gone, replaced by an app that tells you what you spent after the fact, never before. And so people arrive at the end of the month the way Dorothy arrived at the beginning, staring at a number, feeling afraid, with no system in place to make the fear mean something useful. She wasn't a financial genius. She wasn't extraordinary. She was a woman with a pencil, a green ledger, and a set of habits so quiet and consistent that they compounded, the way discipline always compounds, into something that looked from the outside like luck. It wasn't luck. It was intention, practiced every month, in a kitchen, after midnight, while everyone else was asleep. You don't need her exact system, but you need something like it. Something that puts the pause back in, something that makes the spending feel real before the money is gone. She figured that out in 1959. The question is whether we're willing to learn it now.